Okay, so now we're going to move on to chapter 2. We've done with general introduction into chemistry, general introduction in terms of how we utilize measurements and manipulate measurements. And chapter 2, now we're going to start to get into bonding theories. And we were just discussing in previous videos how we kind of view atoms as these indestructible circles, these indestructible spheres, and we see that we kind of lose a lot of information if that's where we stop in terms of our analysis. It is a useful concept and it's a useful model, but we're going to expand upon it now, okay? What you'll see if you look at the PowerPoint for chapter 2 is slides 1 and 2. Those are a good review of video material we've already done. So I do ask you to go and look at that and make sure you understand what's shown there and how it relates to information that you should already know. What chapter 2 starts out with in full is what we're going to call atomic structure, okay? So if it's not just a little indestructible sphere, how do we view the makeup of an atom, okay? An atom has a nucleus at its center, okay? The nucleus has a positive charge, right? And most of the mass of the atom is actually in that nuclear center, okay? In that nucleus, there are two types of particles. There are protons and there are neutrons, okay? There's a couple different symbols for protons. Protons are really important because they actually give you the ID of the atom. They give you the identity of the element. Protons are sometimes given the symbol P plus, and a lot of times you'll see me use the symbol H plus. Your book uses that as well, all right? Both of these mean a single proton, okay? The count of the number of protons is what we're gonna call the atomic number. So the number of protons, how many there are, determines the identity of an element, all right? Because that number is so important, it gets a special label, atomic number. We give the symbol Z as a stand-in for atomic number. So you're going to see in subsequent parts of this video, we're going to write down Z. That stands in for the number of protons, right? Also in the nucleus, we mentioned neutrons. Neutrons do not have a charge. Protons are positive, okay? That's where the positive part of the nucleus is. Neutrons do not have a charge at all right? They add mass and stability to the nucleus, okay? They don't matter as much to us this semester, but one thing they do is that if you look at two atoms and they have the same number of protons, they have the same atomic number, they might have different number of neutrons. And if you have a different number of neutrons, you have what's known as an isotope, right? And we'll talk about those in a little bit of detail in a bit, right? So at the center of an atom, there's this positive core, okay? And that's where the protons and the neutrons exist. And then outside that atom, all right? And they don't really like follow any patterns here, and we kind of spend a whole chapter talking about it. But what I want you to kind of view is that in general, there's this semi-spherical shape, and that's a region where you find electrons, okay? So it's a lot of empty space, but out inside here, these squiggles aren't really representing electrons. They're just kind of representing a space where the electron might be found. Outside the nucleus, not in orbits, not going around in circles. There's just this space where you find electrons. Now for chemists, electrons, which are given the symbol E minus, yeah, outside the nucleus, are electrons. Electrons are given the symbol E minus. For chemists, all right, electrons are pretty much the most important part of understanding behavior because these are the species that are exchanged or shared to form bonds. So before where we would show like two spheres touching to indicate that we have a bond and we said, well, don't really worry about what's going on in there. Now we're going to start to worry about how that bond forms. And actually what happens is all about watching what the electrons do. Sometimes a species will give up an electron to form an ion. Sometimes the electrons are shared. If you have two ions of opposite charge close to each other, they grab onto each other. These are the sorts of things that we're going to deal with this chapter. So this is like a kind of atomic structure overview. Still underneath atomic structure, I want to kind of talk about some other important things, other important concepts. The next one being, right, we're going to talk about what are known as atomic symbols. And essentially what atomic symbols do is they organize a bunch of information into a nice concrete little picture, all right? Atomic symbols have Z, which we know is the atomic number in them. they also have A, which is known as the mass number. And we find the mass number by adding, right, the atomic number plus the number of neutrons. Okay? Remember, the atomic number is the number of protons. The mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Okay? You'll also sometimes see a charge listed, right, in an atomic symbol. The charge is based on an imbalance, right, of electrons and protons. So if the number of electrons and the number of protons is different, the atomic symbol will show a charge. If there are more protons than electrons, the charge of the whole entire atom, the charge of the whole entire element will be positive. Positive ions we call cations. If there are more electrons than protons, right, then we'll get a negative ion. And negative ions are known as anions. Okay? So this is a lot to digest, but, all right, you can kind of see for in a few little examples how this works. Right. We're going to start kind of referencing the periodic table here and there. We will get into a lot more detail in what the periodic table is, comprised of in a bit. But say, for instance, we look at a species and we're given this atomic symbol. Okay? This is the sort of atomic symbol you'll see, and I just kind of want to write the general structure off to the side here. Okay? What you'll see for your atomic symbol is there's going to be a placeholder here, and I'm going to call this the Greek letter chi. Now, chi is going to be one of the elements from the periodic table, okay? In this case, I'm picking H, which is hydrogen, okay? What we do then to indicate what type of hydrogen we have is down here, we indicate the number of protons. Down here, we write the atomic number, right? Up here, we write the mass number, right? So remember on the last bit of work that we did written down here, Z is the number of protons, A is the number of protons plus neutrons, right? Up here, we leave a space for charge, okay? So if there's an imbalance in protons and electrons, you'll see a plus or a minus there. Maybe it's +1, maybe it's -1, maybe it's -2, +2, etc. That's all based on an imbalance of electrons and protons. If we go back and now analyze this, this tells us something about this particular atom, okay? Now, here's the thing. This atomic symbol here, H, is tied to that 1. And what I mean by that is, remember, if this is Z, the number of protons determine the identity of that element, okay? So if I change this to a 2, what's going to end up happening is, all right, this symbol will change as this change. And the reason I'm bringing this up again and again is just to sort of solidify the idea that if you change the number of protons, you change the identity of the element. Every element gets its own little marker, its own little label here. For hydrogen, which has 1 proton, all right, we have an H. For helium, which has 2 protons, we have an He, okay? So let's go back up to this hydrogen example. What does this tell us about this hydrogen? Well, we should be able to analyze this symbol, and we should be able to look at it and say, okay, what are the number of protons in this? The number of protons looks like there must be 1. What about the number of neutrons? Well, the number of neutrons, this up here, this is the number of protons plus neutrons. So if I know there's 1 proton, then that tells me that there must be 1 neutron to make the mass number 2. Okay? What about the number of electrons? Well, do you see an imbalance in charge? Is there any charge indicated up here? Well, no. So if there's no charge here, we say that the atom is neutral, okay? We wouldn't write in a 0. It's kind of implied that it's missing there. It doesn't have a charge. So that means that the number of protons and the number of electrons must be equal. Okay. Now let's look at this helium example here, and let's kind of give this a charge to show you a different type of sort of analysis that we can enact here. Okay, so if I look at this helium example, well, what about the number of protons here? How many protons do we have? Well, that's always this atomic number, and helium will always have 2 protons. And if I change the number of protons, I change the identity of the element. What about the number of neutrons here? Now, it's not always the case that they're equal, but we see in these 2 examples that they just happen to be. The mass number is 4. There are 2 protons, so that means to get to 4, there must be 2 different neutrons. Okay? Now, what about the number of electrons? And that's where remembering charge of these species becomes important. Okay? So right now I see that this symbol is different. We actually have something indicating there. And we're showing that this element has a +2 charge. It is a cation, right? So how does it have a +2 charge? Well, it has 2 protons, right? Each proton is +1, right? Each proton is positively charged. So how many electrons must there be, right, to get a total charge of +2? Well, there must be no electrons present canceling out that charge, right? Here in this case, just again to reinforce the example, there's 1 proton, there's no charge, so there must be 1 electron balancing out that charge. Do you see how these numbers are the same when we have a neutral species, but these numbers are different when we have an ion? That's an important idea to kind of get down, okay? Let's look at one other example here. Let's do 2 more examples, actually. Let's take a look at O16 minus 2, right? O16 minus 2. Try to pause the video here. Let's answer these questions we've been answering. Number of protons, number of neutrons, number of electrons. Try to figure it out based off the last 2 examples. I'll pause just briefly so that you can pause if you would like. So the number of protons is down here. Oxygen is O. Oxygen always has 8 protons. If I change that, then I change the identity of that element, and I would have to change the atomic symbol accordingly based off of that. This has, I picked it again, sorry. This has a number of neutrons that's equal to the number of protons. I promise that doesn't always happen, but notice we have an 8 down here, we have a 16 up here. So we have 8 protons, 8 plus 8 gives me 16. Okay, so there must be 8 neutrons. This has a -2 charge, okay? So this means there's extra negative charge. Well, what in an actual species, what in an atom provides negative charge? Electrons. So if I have negative charges up there, that means I have too many electrons, okay? So I have 8 pluses. Well, how many electrons must there be to get to -2? There must be 10 different electrons, all right? We see again that there's an imbalance between the number of protons and the number of electrons, and actually we have 2 extra electrons, so I have an extra -2 charge for this anion, all right, for this anion, right? Let's take a look at isotopes, right? We mentioned the word before. Let's take a look at neutral, oxygen 16, okay? Oh yeah, that's one other thing that we say. We would call this oxygen 16. We would call this carbon 12, okay? Why don't we call this 8 oxygen 16? Well, remember, if I change this 8, it wouldn't be oxygen. So saying oxygen 16 is enough information. We would call this carbon 12. Oxygen also exists as oxygen 17. Carbon exists as carbon 12 and also carbon, all right, 13, all right? If you look at these and we analyze them, okay, look at them in pairs. These 2 elements here, all right, they're exactly the same with one exception. The exception is this mass number. So what must be different to make the mass number bigger? Well, we see down here that they're both oxygen. They have a set Z, so that must mean that they have a different number of neutrons, all right? Whenever we have these species that are exactly the same, and they'll behave the same chemically, because the number of protons determines the chemical behavior. That's why we get this symbol O no matter what, all right? When we have 8 protons, they'll behave similarly chemically, but they have a different mass. Different mass because different neutrons. We call these guys isotopes. Right. These guys down here are also isotopes. They're species that have the same Z but different A. Right? I'm going to write that down. Same Z but different A. Same number of protons but different number of neutrons. Right? Just to make sure you understand that general concept, are oxygen and carbon, like take a look at these guys here, I'll put them in purple. Our oxygen and carbon isotopes. Is oxygen 16 an isotope of carbon 12? Well, no. The first requirement is you have to be talking about the same element, okay? Are we talking about the same element here? Well, no. The number of protons determines the element. If one is 8 and one is 6, these are not the same, okay? So these guys would not be isotopes. So with this little bit of idea, we can now go on and talk about more detailed concepts regarding, like I mentioned before, the periodic table, atomic masses, and then get into an intro of bonding. But again, there's some important information here that's going to be reiterated. This chapter, as always, just digest it as much as you can and let me know if you have any questions.